Dr. Jud Brewer, thank you for being on Anxiety Bites. I'm going to ask you, what is your past relationship to anxiety and what's your current relationship to anxiety today?
I'd be happy to, to explore my relationship with anxiety. It started way back in the day. Actually, I didn't even know I had anxiety in college. I remember
Yeah.
having, let's just say, some GI issues. I talk a little bit about this at the end of my book. And I thought,
Your new book, Unwinding
yes,
Anxiety, is
yes,
that
in
right?
that book.
Yes.
And I, done a bunch of backpacking in college and was also, always concerned about, getting bacterial infections from not, carefully filtering my water. And so my senior year, I remember going to the student health and the doctor there, these GI issues. And he said, "Oh, could you be stressed out?" And I was like, "No, not me. I'm not stressed. I play the violin. I run. I'm a vegetarian, blah, blah, blah." And he goes, "Okay." So long story short, it turned out that I had irritable bowel syndrome, which is totally stress and anxiety related. And so, so that was my first encounter, let's say, with anxiety, not even knowing it. And so I think anxiety can really be a shapeshifter in many ways. Long story short, I went on to get panic attacks during residency and, in my psychiatry residency, which was really fun because then, after I'd have a panic attack, I could go down the diagnostic checklist and be like, check, 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 check. Yeah, I just had a panic attack, And today I would say, a lot of what I've learned about my own mind has helped me work with anxiety. I certainly get sensations and feelings that come up, but I'm much more able to manage and work with it. And I I jokingly say, well, I wrote this book because I was anxious about how to help my patients with anxiety because, what I learned in medical school and residency was to prescribe medications. And the gold standard medications out there, there's this term in medicine called number needed to treat, which gives us a quick and dirty estimate of how well something works. So the higher the number, the worse it is. So with medications, that number needed to treat is 5.2, meaning you have to treat 5 patients before one person shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So you can imagine for 5 patients come into my office in one day, I don't know which of those 5 is going to benefit. And so I'm basically playing the medication lottery with them. And I don't know what I'm going to do with the other 80%. So I'm getting anxious about how to help my patients with anxiety. So that's my, my previous and I guess current relationship is I've been blown away with what I've learned about my own mind. So I started meditating at the beginning of medical school, first day of medical school. And over the last 25 years, have learned so much about how my mind works and all these twists and turns and serendipity around how anxiety can be driven, that's where we started developing programs. And then as a researcher, testing them to see how well they can work. And long story short, that's why I wrote this Unwinding Anxiety book, was to make it accessible, make these tools accessible to anyone.
Man, I wish you'd been around when I was a teenager with anxiety and no internet and didn't know what it was and was afraid to ask the librarian if they had any books about the brain because I thought she was going to say, "Oh, I have to call the hospital and you're going to have to live there the rest of your life. Are you perhaps anxious? That's very bad,
Yeah. Can you hold for 1 minute, please?" And then she starts whispering. Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me get into this. And I want to talk about, obviously, your book and your app. But I have a question about the brain, because you are also a neuroscientist. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, when the hell are our brains going to evolve past this? Because if I hear one more time, "Oh, it's left over from being a caveman." Well, okay, but when? When will this change? When will this default setting to being anxious and overreacting, when? In our lifetime? No, right?
From a genetic perspective, not in our lifetime.
Yeah.
From a functional perspective, I think it can happen, this evolutionary process can happen pretty quickly. So you can look at to see how quickly we have learned to use technology as a way to leverage attention, right? So that happened pretty darn quickly, within, 1800s, there were, first researchers showing that animals could learn how to get out of cages by getting a food reward. So that was, late 1800s. That was 120 years ago. And now you can look at social media and how they are totally getting us all addicted to those things. So this process has been understood and people have adapted it to capture our attention. And this has also driven our anxiety. And so that as soon as we learn how that works, the way I think of it is if we can learn how our minds work, then we can start to work with our minds. And so in that sense, just like, it's capturing our attention, it's capturing the uncertainty, around, I think of it this way, the only certain thing is that there's always going to be uncertainty. So that's not actually something that we want to evolve beyond because that helps us survive. But what we can learn is how that uncertainty drives anxiety. And that's something that we can learn to work with within months. For example, my lab's done several clinical studies where we got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores in anxious physicians using an app. We did a study with generalized anxiety disorder. We got a 67% reduction. And there we could actually calculate that number needed to treat, that thing I mentioned earlier. Ready for this? So with medications, it's 5. With this study, it was 1.6. So
it only takes 1.6 people doing this kind of mindful thought, behavioral work around anxiety to see a result.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
That's great. When I first found out 20 years ago when I went to therapy for panic, and it was explained to me that it's just my adrenaline kind of freaking out, and it's this leftover thing from, my brain just trying to protect me. That was of great comfort. But I know for some people that it can seem like, oh, great, well, now it can't be fixed. But like a lot of things, we can actually change our mind, literally.
Literally, we can. And I think one thing that I see that gets conflated or mushed together is people conflating the survival piece with the actual anxiety piece. So if you think of the caveman brain, it was really set up to develop habits, where it's about learning where to remember food is and also how to avoid danger. On top of that's been layered the neocortex, literally the new brain, which helps us survive in a different way, which is through thinking and planning. And that survival comes based on getting information, like accurate information in the present moment. So our brains can basically simulate based on past experience using information that we have. So here, it's about, if we don't have accurate information, that's when our brain starts spinning out of control into anxiety. And I want folks to be very, to understand that, because it's not just our adrenaline. Certainly when we get freaked out, our adrenaline pumps, but it's not that, that fear reaction that happens really quickly, actually faster than we can even think. That's a survival mechanism that helps us learn to avoid danger. That's different than anxiety. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And yeah, I'm glad you separated that for me too, because I think like you said, anxiety is a shapeshifter. And I think sometimes I have conflated that fear instinct with anxiety.
Yes. So we all have times when we're anxious. And when we worry, for example, that can actually feed back and basically kick in our adrenaline that makes us more anxious. So I have a lot of patients in my clinic who, when they go to bed, their head hits the pillow and their brain starts thinking, it's like their brain says, okay, it's my turn now. I had a chance to talk. And now we start regretting the things we've done during the day, or we start worrying about the future. And then they look at the clock and they think, I got to get sleep because I got this thing to do tomorrow, and which of course jacks their adrenaline. It makes it much harder for them to sleep.
Yeah, right. So now they've just created this kind of thought pattern of now the anxiety is about the sleep.
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
From Cavalry Audio, the studio that brought you The Devil Within and The Shadow Girls, comes a new true crime podcast, The Pink Moon Murders.
The local sheriff believes there may be more than one killer. It's been 4 days since those bodies were found, and there's no arrest as of this morning.
They were afraid, especially out in that area. What if they come back or whatever?
It scared me to death. It scared me. I was very, very intimidated to live here.
Crazy to think you go to sleep one night, maybe snuggling with your loved one, and never wake up. Or maybe you wake up in a struggle for your life, which you lose.
Join host David Ratterman as he explores one fateful night when evil descended upon small-town Ohio.
Killed 8 members of an Ohio family in a pre-planned execution.
A family was targeted, most of them targeted while they were sleeping.
Follow The Pink Moon Murders on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sir, we got your test results back, and...
Give it to me straight, Doc.
You have to listen to the podcast Ridiculous News.
Ridiculous News? The podcast? Ridiculous News?
It's a podcast hosted by Bill Worley and Mark Kendall. Ridiculous News.
Those two comedians based out of Atlanta, Georgia?
Oh, so you've heard of them. You know, I always knew you were my favorite patient.
Well, you're the best doctor I've ever had, and yeah, they're hilarious. I love their videos. Bill's actually my cousin. They talk about the news, but not like in a depressing way, you know what I mean? Like they did an episode about April Fools.
Great, you get it. So you need to listen to it.
Well, where do I find it?
You get it wherever you find podcasts.
Oh, like in a cereal box?
Well, no, I mean, that's not where you find a podcast.
Oh, so like in the middle of a tree?
No. Do you know what a podcast is?
Yeah, it's like a shoebox size.
No, not at all. It's something that you listen to.
Huh.
Listen to Ridiculous News on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Oh, the produce aisle.
Absolutely not.
Hey, it's Alec Baldwin. On this season of Here's the Thing, I speak with more actors, musicians, writers, policymakers, and so many other fascinating people, like comedian Tim Dillon.
I couldn't tell you my congressman. I know every maitre d' of every restaurant. I know who's working Craig's. I know who's working, all the places I want to go. Who's at El Pastel?
When I'm in town, you come with me. We're going to go to Craig's. Host of The Talk, Amanda Klutz.
I did Broadway for 17 years. When you do that, it kind of prepares you for anything in life.
And the multi-talented musician and actor, Steven Van Zandt.
When it comes to performing, that's just like a vacation for me. Whether it's acting or whether it's being a rock star on stage, that stuff is just nothing but fun for me. The real work is looking at a blank piece of paper and creating something from it,
Listen to Here's the Thing on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
What's the story on chemical imbalances? I mean, is it just sort of a thing that people say and it's not really something we're born with, or can we change our chemistry in our brain?
Well, we can certainly change our chemistry in our brain. Thoughts will literally have chemical cascades that lead to, chemical reactions. So in that sense, we are basically just a jumble of chemistry. If you look at the chemical imbalance thing, I think it's a simple and quick explanation. Oh, take this pill because it's a chemical imbalance and it's going to help with the chemical. For some people, they have genetic polymorphisms, meaning that the proteins that are expressed on certain cells look slightly differently than other people, which can affect how certain neurotransmitters, function in their brain. And for some people, things like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the first line treatment, like the Prozacs, the Zolofts, the Paxils of the world.
Yeah.
That's how, for some people, those can be helpful. Yet, this is where this number needed to treat comes in. It should be noted that historically, these were developed as antidepressants. And people just started using them, testing them out with anxiety and found, oh, they're better than placebo, so we'll prescribe those as well. Uh-huh. So, they affect serotonin reuptake. That's where their name comes from. But it doesn't necessarily mean, especially for the majority of the population, some chemical imbalance in their brain. It means this is the best we've got. And here's our explanation. So try the pill. And because they're generally benign, they generally don't have side effects for most people. And it's hard to overdose on them. For a psychiatrist or even a general, practitioner, like a primary care provider, to prescribe these things and not worry about it too much. And there's also, the added benefit of having a placebo effect. Oh, I'm taking a pill to help my brain. And, that's not to discount the placebo effect. For some medications, that's the majority of the effect that's happening. And from my clinical perspective, it's like, whatever, if this is helping and it's not harming, game on.
So in terms of the type of therapist someone should see, right? If they're experiencing, let's say, daily anxiety attacks, whether it's thought spiraling or sweaty palms or whatnot, or they're avoiding certain things driving on the freeway, they're, certain places give them panic attacks, the whole shebang. and they're looking in a directory and they're looking to find a therapist, is there something they should be looking for? Because I know that for me, when I was having daily panic attacks, my therapist wanted to go back into childhood, which is great, but wasn't going to help me have some tools to bring to the office the next day. Mm-hmm. And I believe in my recovery as an anxious person that I need the tools now because I need to just be able to function. And then once I'm better, sure, let's go back to childhood. Let's talk about this. I get it. But what would you tell someone to look for?
So as a card-carrying psychiatrist who is trained about the whole childhood thing and all that, it wasn't until I became a neuroscientist that I started to realize, neuroscience may play a bigger role here in helping people with anxiety than going back to our childhood. And that childhood piece may be somewhat of a holdover from, whether it's Freudian days or whatever, in a way that we're just trained, this is what we should be doing. But if you look at it, especially looking at how anxiety is driven, so this was something I did not learn in residency training. This is something that I learned afterwards, serendipitously, when I was studying habit change. We were developing programs for smoking and for overeating. And especially we have this Eat Right Now app that we were studying with folks. And folks were saying to me, I remember somebody asking, hey, I'm realizing that anxiety is triggering me to stress eat. Can you create a program for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medications, but they don't work that well. So it put a bug in my ear. And it was actually back in the 80s when Prozac, first came out, that people were doing research suggesting that anxiety could be driven like other habits. And this is really what this, I had this light bulb moment where I was like, I never learned that. Why didn't I learn that in residency? And the reason I mention that is that when I started looking into the neuroscience behind how that works, it's like, habits are driven through rewards, not based on childhood. There's actually a formula called the Skorla-Wagner curve. The details aren't important. But basically, how rewarding a behavior is going to drive 100% whether we perpetuate it or not, whether we keep doing it or not. Childhood is nowhere in that equation. You want to change a behavior, including worrying, which drives anxiety. It's not about going back into the childhood. It's about what's happening now, what's driving this, and can we take a neuroscience-based approach? So long answer to your short question, whoever it is, make sure that they're actually up on the current neuroscience and not just, I had Freudian psychoanalysis training or something like that. Nothing wrong with that. But we know a lot more now than was known in Freud's days.
But I think it is a sophisticated concept that, okay, you're doing this habit, this anxiety, whether it's the kind of thought spiraling you're doing before you go on a trip or you're drinking every night to handle the work stress, whatever it is, you're actually getting some kind of reward, however disordered it is, from doing this. Let's look at it and get you a better reward. I mean, first right there, somebody has to be willing to say, for lack of a better word, it's my quote fault. But I feel like that must be challenging to, I think there's some comfort in saying, no, I'm not doing anything wrong. Life is happening to me. Now fix it. Don't make me change something. That must be extremely challenging in your practice, right?
It can be. And I actually learned something from one of my patients that I've used to help my other patients with this exact question that you're asking, which is one of my patients. So as I was working with a patient and helping her understand, this was basically, her brain trying to help her survive, this thinking and planning brain going offline. She actually started using this mantra with herself when she noticed that she was starting to get revved up with anxiety. She just used this mantra, oh, that's just my brain. And what that reminded her of was that it was her brain doing this thing. It wasn't actually her fault. And it could also help her remind herself, oh, I know how to work with this, so she could ground herself and actually work with it.
That's incredible. Yeah, because I do think the irony about anxious people, myself included, is we just want control. We want to control the universe. We want to control, everything. And things like your book, Unwinding Anxiety, and working with a therapist, you're actually being given the greatest gift: control, options, choices. And we're like, no. I don't want to, it's just funny. I saw that so many years in myself, like someone is giving me exactly what I want. Here, you can control this. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do it. And so, it's tough. I mean, like everything you're saying in your book makes total sense, but I imagine as the person that has to work with people, it might take a beat to get there, right?
It can. And so here I find two things that are common. One is when the anxiety gets bad enough, it's kind of like somebody getting into the gutter when their drinking becomes bad enough, then they wake up and like, wow, this is a problem. I need to do something about this. So when somebody's anxiety is bad enough, they're more driven to find a solution. I hope that we can reach people before that, because I hate to see people suffer from debilitating anxiety. The other piece is to really be able to see, this is just my brain. And we're giving them these tools, think of it as knowledge is power. And so for anybody listening, keep in mind, the more you know about how your mind works, the more you'll be able to work with it. And this applies beyond anxiety. So if you're not sure if you have anxiety or not, just think of any habit that you have, and this same process can be applied in the same way, and then maybe examine whether you've got a little bit of anxiety and then use it in the same way.
And I want to empower everyone listening to be able to claim anxiety. I think so many people think it is this big bad disorder, and they can't say they have it because they don't have it as bad as this and that. And it's like, I just think anxiety is sort of the human condition in a way.
Yes.
Whether some people experience it often or not.
I like the way you put
fine.
that. So there is one condition that I, with 100% certainty, can say that we all have, which you just named, the human condition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in that human condition is a whole range of emotions and a whole range of states. And our brains are they're just trying to gather information so they can predict the future. And when there's uncertainty, we might get a little anxious. And that's okay. And the more we can notice more quickly that we're anxious, the more we can actually get our thinking and planning brain back online and get back on track.
So let's talk about how we do some of that. So maybe explain to everyone what's an adaptive versus a maladaptive behavior, and how does that get us on the road to learning about changing our habits with anxiety?
Well, let's use any habit as an example. So we form habits through a simple process, 3 elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So an adaptive habit, you can think, I won't use too many examples from our ancient ancestors, because I agree with you. I think that's overplayed. But it's helpful to just kind of conceptualize where this comes from. So imagine our ancient ancestors didn't have refrigerators, right? They didn't have sources of food that they could get every day. They had to go find food. And so the brains are set up, and our brains are still set up this way, to go find the food. So the first element is a trigger. They see the food, there's the trigger. They eat the food, there's the behavior, that's the second element. And then the third element is, from a neuroscience perspective, a reward, where their brain, their stomach sends this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So an adaptive habit is to remember where food is. Another adaptive habit in modern day is to, think of all the habits that we have that we do every day, like tying our shoes, putting our clothes on, walking, eating breakfast, making coffee. Imagine having to relearn those things every day. We'd be exhausted by the end of breakfast. So the idea there is there are tons of adaptive habits that we take for granted because they're habitual. We do them without thinking. That's basically what a habit is. It's an automatic behavior that's just cued. So we've got habits. Most of our habits are adaptive. And then sometimes they become maladaptive. So based on what we've learned, they can not be so helpful. So maybe an example would be, adaptive habit is learning how to eat. Maladaptive habit would be learning the value of chocolate cake. So we set down this reward value of chocolate cake. Typically it starts, okay, let's go back to childhood. Are you ready? So
I'm ready.
So we go to birthday parties when we're kids, and we associate cake with not only tasting good, but ice cream and presents and friends and parties. And for me, did you ever go to a roller skating birthday party? Yeah.
Oh, you bet fun. I did.
So
yeah.
I associate that with roller skating sometimes. And so imagine all the times we lay down that reward value as a kid, And then when we're not a kid anymore, when we were kids, we could eat cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? It didn't affect us at all. Just we're like, boom, I'll have more cake. Now I get a sugar rush and crash when I eat cake, so I have to eat it very judiciously, And if I ate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, things probably wouldn't go so well in terms of my body feeling good and my brain functioning. So we can see how that can become maladaptive if we just carry that habit forward. I'm just going to eat cake the rest of my life. So that's where the same behavior can be just fine, and then it becomes maladaptive. So I think of, the far end of the habit spectrum is addiction, right? And the simple definition there is like continued use despite adverse consequences. So that can be applied to everything from overeating to smoking, you ready for this, to worrying, right? Because worrying tends to be maladaptive. It just gets us all fired up with adrenaline. It doesn't help us solve problems. Actually, it moves us in the opposite direction because it's harder to think and plan when we're worrying. Yet it becomes rewarding in the sense that even if we can't control the situation, we at least feel like we're doing something. It's like the parent worrying about their kid. I'm like, I don't know if he or she is safe. Well, I'll just worry about them until they get home. I can promise you their worrying did not keep their kids safe, but it gave them something to do.
It's like if you're driving on the freeway, deadlocked traffic, and you start taking side streets. It takes the same amount of time, but you felt like you were doing something, and you still were late to the thing because there were just too many cars on the road that day, And I really relate to that. In my days of fear flying, I had maladaptive habits. I had the habit of doing certain thinking, which only increased my anxiety and panic on the flight. And I couldn't let it go because the reward I was getting was that I had convinced myself that I was inherently doing something dangerous. And I survived it because I got lucky, when the plane landed safely. And that all of my worrying was keeping me in reality. I had this very insistent thing that, listen, nobody bullshit me here. I don't want to hear about everything's okay and blah, blah. I'm going to face reality, I know that wasn't even a question. It was just sort of a rant. And
well, I think you're highlighting something that I think it's helpful to know, which is our brains love to make associations, right? One of the biggest ones that I see is performance anxiety, where people feel like, well, I was anxious and I performed well, so therefore anxiety helped me perform well. Wrong, actually, wrong, dead wrong. There's no evidence to support the fact that anxiety makes people perform better. In fact, there's plenty of research showing that there's an inverse relationship, meaning the more anxious someone is, the worse they perform. Now, I don't know about you when you've performed, but the peak of performance is when people talk about being in flow or being in the zone. And how much anxiety is happening in those moments?
0.
Yes.
And it's interesting you said that. I just figured it out now because I'm not, honest to God, as a performer, I really am not like this big attention-starved person. And so I used to think, well, why the only place I'm not anxious is on stage? And it wasn't because I love the crowd and the applause. It's not that. It's what you're saying. I was in flow. And you can't really be anxious when you're, I don't know, the bad word for that is happy. It's not happy, but when you're focused, what is another way to say
I think
flow?
of this is, in the way that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was the psychologist that coined the term flow, is that we're outside of ourselves. We're merged with it. It's like action and events are merged into one, where we lose all sense of who we are. We lose a sense of self. So he describes this as effortless, it's selfless, it's joyful, it's timeless, all these things that you talked about. And if you think of anxiety, so anxiety feels closed down, it feels contracted. Flow feels such the opposite, so expanded that you can think of anxiety says, okay, here I am because I'm feeling anxious. When we've expanded that to infinity, we lose a sense of where we end and where the rest of the world begins. And in fact, this is where my lab has done some research, some neuroscience research on this, where there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is involved in self-referential processing. Basically, when we're thinking about ourselves, it gets activated. And it gets really active.
You said that's called the default mode network?
Yeah, it's called the default mode network because It is what we default to when we're not doing anything else. In fact, it probably we're defaulting to this about 50% of waking life. Like this is the
thinking